when I put them into super long videos. So we're just gonna get started. I got this one. I really liked what was featured in it for you guys. It wasn't a bunch of cases I've already covered. Yes, it is some, of course, but not all cases that I've already covered. And it is 180 pages, so I feel like it should be some good content for you guys. I am still getting over whatever this sickness is. So is Sean. It's like in my ears now, and it's just terrible. So hopefully I don't sound too terribly different, and it is still good content for you guys. So let's just get started. Serial killers. Now, just looking at the front of this, I recognize some of these people. Obviously, you've got Jeffrey Dahmer, you've got Ted Bundy, which I feel like I've done so many videos on him, and I still learn stuff about his cases. The Son of Sam. This is Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. I did a huge video on him. The way he was caught still blows my mind, but no spoilers. If I go over any cases in this video that I have covered in depth, I will tag them. Link them down below. Let's see, I also see John Wayne Gacy here, and I covered that as well. So, this is not just cases, it is what goes on inside the brain of a serial killer, and I thought that was pretty interesting. It's not something we've ever really talked about here on my channel, so we're just gonna get started. In the summer of 2023, the case of 33-year-old nurse Lucy Letby hit the headlines. Instead of caring for newborn babies in the neonatal unit where she worked, Letby was sentenced to life imprisonment for the sadistic murders of 7 babies and the attempted murders of 6 others. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the FBI knocked on the door of a 59-year-old family man and architect, accusing him of the murders of several escorts found at Gilgo Beach on Long Island more than a decade ago. DNA from a pizza box and clues from the suspect's mobile phone may somewhere no one knew them. But something caught the attention of the police. The three missing people had a lot in common. They were all middle-aged with roots in Central or Southern Asia, and they were all well known in Toronto's gay village, in its homosexual community. The common denominators might have been random, but they created a pattern. If the three men had been victims of a crime, it was likely that the same perpetrator was behind all three. And if so, if they had been murdered, the culprit was a serial killer. The FBI defines a serial killer as someone who murders at least two people on different occasions, with a certain amount of time between attacks. The time aspect distinguishes a serial killer from a mass murderer, who, for example, goes into a school and kills several people over a short span of time. Even though a serial killer waits weeks or months between their killings and often takes long breaks, the number of murders over the years can easily exceed even the most horrific mass murderer. That's super frightening to think about, actually. In the 1990s, Colombian serial killer Luis Gravito, also known as La Bestia, the Beast. I know I did not say that right. Wreaked havoc in 3 South American countries. He ended up being convicted of 138 murders, but police suspect him of killing more than twice that many. Although it's not part of the definition of a serial killer, they are often characterized by carrying out murders in a specific way, going after a certain type of victim. Luis Garavito's victims were easy to recognize. They were boys between the ages of 6 and 16, often homeless city dwellers or poor farm workers. They were tied up, tortured, and assaulted before being stabbed to death with a knife or a screwdriver. Goodness! Police use such commonalities to create a profile of the serial killer and his victims. This profile helps investigators link relevant cases together and get a sense of what the offender is like and where they can find him. The missing men in Toronto suggested someone had frequented the same places as middle-aged gay immigrants, so the police started their investigation in the city's gay village. In 2013, an anonymous tip sent the police on the trail of 61-year-old self-employed landscape gardener Bruce MacArthur. The source said MacArthur had had an affair with 2 of the missing men, and he did not deny it. He even said that one of them had been employed by his small company for a while. The police did not target MacArthur, but saw him as a witness who could give them insight into the missing man's coming and goings. They found nothing suspicious, and since no bodies had been found, they couldn't even be sure a crime had been committed. So the police dropped the case. What? 2 years later, in 2015, the case files were dusted off one by one, as more middle-aged men began to disappear again in Toronto. Although they didn't all perfectly fit the profile, the police were no longer in doubt that there was a link between them. And then in June 2017, a 49-year-old man disappeared without a trace during Toronto's Pride Festival, and it became a turning point in this investigation. When the police searched the man's apartment, they discovered the name Bruce police had spoken to just 4 years earlier. I'm gonna mute my laptop because I forgot again. Patreon fam knows. MacArthur had subsequently sold his car, but the police managed to track it to a scrapyard and impound it. Once they examined the vehicle, they found traces of DNA that matched the man who disappeared during Pride, as well as... oh, it actually doesn't go to this page. Traces from another man who'd been reported missing 2 months earlier. The net was tightening around MacArthur, and when police secretly searched his house, cloned the hard drive of his computer, forensic investigators found pictures of the 2 missing men, and in the pictures, both men were dead. The landscape gardener was put under surveillance, and when a Middle Eastern man knocked on his door in January of 2018 and was let inside, the police decided to act. It probably saved the man's life. He was already tied to MacArthur's bed when officers entered. Police searched the apartment and found photos of several of the missing men, but the most macabre discoveries came to light when police dogs were unleashed in 5 gardens where he'd previously worked as a gardener. Oh no. Several large plant pots attracted the dog's interest, and the skeletal remains of 6 different men were found in the compost. Oh no. Everything now suggested that the landscape gardener was a brutal serial killer who had exploited his victims, killed them, and mutilated them, and then hidden their body parts around the city. What? How did I not know about this? In the ensuing trial, MacArthur confessed to 8 murders, but gave no explanation as to what drove him to commit his crimes. In February of 2019, he was sentenced to life, and men in Toronto's gay village breathed a sigh of relief and finally began to feel a little safer. What? Bruce MacArthur is one of history's more recent serial killers, but he is far from the only one. Serial killers are found in all guises, such as Chinese Yang Zinai, who also around the turn of the millennium broke into isolated houses and killed all those inside with an axe, a hammer, or a shovel. Whoa. Austria's Black Widow. Oh man, this is a name. Elfriede Blaumensteiner, who in the 80s and 90s talked elderly people into including her in their wills and then killed them with poison. In many cases, police have a hard time detecting the serial killer because the bodies have been hidden and never show up, making it uncertain whether a crime has taken place or not. Although MacArthur was careful to cut up zombies by drilling holes in their skulls and injecting hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their frontal lobes while they were still alive. It was a clean confession. All the police had to do was identify the victims. However, 11 years later in southern United States, the police did not get off so lightly. A 15-year-old girl was watering flowers in a friend's front yard when a man in a car stopped. He threatened her with a gun and forced her to crawl into a large plastic container on the back seat of the car. He gagged her with paper towels and drove her back to his house, where he assaulted her for hours. In the evening, he tied the girl to his bed with ropes and put her in a pair of blue fur-lined handcuffs. He then lay down to sleep next to her. Once he'd fallen asleep, the teenager managed to untie the knots and escape, still wearing the handcuffs. These manticles would later play a central role in the revelation of a triple mass murderer. I believe I covered this one. I did, yes. The girl alerted the police, and was able to set them on the trail of her assailant. It turned out to be 38-year-old Richard Ivanitz. Officers went to his apartment, but he had woken up and fled before they arrived. 3 days later, he was recognized in Florida. When the police surrounded him after a high-speed car chase, he unalived himself. But the police were not about to close this case. They wanted to know whether he could be linked to previous unsolved aggravated assaults and murders. The police were particularly interested in 3 similar cases from 96 and 97, in which teenage girls had been abducted from their front yards. After a few days or weeks, the girls' bodies had been found in streams or lakes, each bearing clear signs of SA. These 3 killings had already been the subject of intense investigation, and police had followed up on more than 12,000 leads from the public. My goodness. DNA samples from crime scenes had been run through databases, and over 10,000 pieces of evidence had been examined and compared with those from 45,000 other unsolved cases. My gosh. Unfortunately, all this work had not brought investigators any closer to the culprit, but finally a breakthrough occurred when they used a microscope to study blue synthetic fibers from the fur on the handcuffs that Ivanitz had placed around the 15-year-old's wrist. Clothes, blankets, and other textiles are woven or knitted from threads, which in turn are spun from fibers. These fibers are typically about 0.02 millimeters thick and can be derived from both natural and then synthetic materials, such as wool, cotton, nylon, or viscose. Depending on the nature of the material and the way it is woven or spun, clothing and carpets lose some of these almost microscopic fibers, which in turn can stick to surfaces that they come in contact with. If a girl is abducted and driven to this assailant's home in his car, fibers from the seat cover may settle on her clothes, just as fibers can be transferred from the offender's clothes to the victim during an assault. Therefore, investigators collect fibers from crime scenes and people involved. At large magnification under a microscope, one can determine what material the fibers are made of, and their color and thickness. One can also study the shape of the cross-sections of fibers, whether they bear signs of being made in a certain way. If the police can establish that fibers found on the victim's clothing came from textiles in a fibers are exactly the same. The offender's genes are, in fact, probably just one of several thousand pairs made in a factory from the same fabric and containing exactly the same fibers, which now sit on the legs of just as many other men. OFDOD. I was hoping that would pop my ears, but it definitely did not. Sorry, I tried not to snuffle in your ear there. Okay. In the case of Richard Ivanitz, they started with the blue fibers from the handcuffs around the 15-year-old girl's wrist. They soon discovered identical fibers had been found 5 or 6 years ago on 3 girls who had been assaulted and killed. But those were not the only fibers that linked him to the old murder cases. Police investigators began meticulously collecting and studying fibers from the deceased and his surroundings, and the work soon yielded results. Fibers from the boot of his car matched the ones found on all 3 dead girls. And the same was true of fibers from 2 rugs, a bath mat, and a bedspread in his home. There was no longer any doubt at all that those girls had been in his car and home. He was a mass murderer, and he unalived himself, surrounded by police, shortly after his last failed attempt. Now, fibers are far from the only forensic evidence police can use in their hunt for serial killers. Traditional fingerprints and DNA analysis also play a major role. Between 1985 and 2007, there had been 11 unsolved murders in the city of Los Angeles, where the police had succeeded in securing identical DNA evidence that suggested a common assailant. The problem, however, was that the genetic fingerprint of this DNA didn't match any of the profiles in the police database, so it was impossible to identify a suspect. In 2010, the investigators decided to perform another type of search, one that doesn't look for a perfect match, but rather for some family members who share some DNA. Using this so-called familial DNA analysis, investigators tracked down a young man named Christopher Franklin. He had been convicted of illegal possession of a weapon 2 years earlier, and therefore was now on the police DNA register. However, he was too young to have committed the first murders in the 80s, so investigators instead turned their attention to his father, 57-year-old Lonnie Franklin. He was known to the police, and he had previously served a sentence, but he had mistakenly never been added to the DNA register. Because familial DNA analysis is somewhat controversial, police were unable to confront him and demand a DNA swab to see if it matched the ones from the crime scene. Police therefore had to find another way to legally obtain his DNA. The solution was for a plainclothes officer to follow him. He entered a Los Angeles restaurant and ordered pizza. When he was finished, his plate was carried away by the officer, who was disguised as a waiter. Franklin had not eaten the crust of his pizza, which enabled the officer to take them to the station. In the abandoned food where the suspect had bitten, there were remnants of saliva, in which forensic experts used to extract his DNA. The subsequent DNA analysis showed a match for the samples from 11 unsolved murders. But DNA was not the only forensic clue that identified Franklin as a serial killer. Several of the 11 murders, as well as a number of other unsolved murders from 1985 to 2007, were committed with shots from a 9mm pistol, and police ballistic experts determined that these shots were fired from the same become too enthusiastic and say too much and reveal his identity. The strategy succeeded because in February of 2005, BTK sent a floppy disk containing various messages to the TV station. However, the serial killer made a foolish error because police forensic experts were able to recover data on the disk from a deleted Word document. Dummy. The metadata of the file showed it was last edited by someone named Dennis, and there was some sort of link to a local church. Police soon discovered that one of the church's employees was a man named Dennis Rader. It wasn't long before police could make their move and arrest the 60-year-old, who consequently confessed to all 10 murders. Over the years, police have become increasingly adept at finding patterns in murder cases. Now they're able to pursue a serial killer as soon as they spot a common thread, rather than having to investigate every single case separately. Together with innovative and increasingly refined forensic analysis, new methods have led to just 13% of all serial killers being at liberty long enough to kill 5 or more people before being apprehended. 40 years ago, almost every third serial killer avoided detection, and because murderers are now being caught faster than before, it also means the number of serial killers has dropped by 85% over the past 3 decades. Hopefully, over time, police investigative methods will improve further so that no one needs to fear becoming the victim of a serial killer. And that is the end of part 1 of this video. Let's see. Yeah, so this part is, we're still not getting into the cases yet. Sorry guys, I hope that this is not boring you. I'm finding it quite interesting. Let's see. Where does this part? So, yeah. Okay. That is... Okay. So we're gonna do part 2. I'm gonna take another drink, hopefully not too loudly. And we're gonna continue. A serial killer's brain is shaped by genetic defects and abuse, and of course the train will come through at 9:30 p.m. Yeah, 9:30. Goodness. Recent research has revealed huge insights into psychopaths' brains. Yeah. Defects in brain centers allied with poor neural connections and excessive use of chemical neurotransmitters make the psychopath both unscrupulous and emotionally cold. You'd think. The hope is that this new understanding can provide an effective treatment for the disorder, which so far is incurable. Okay. Okay. I hope this part is as interesting as the last part, because all this sciencey stuff's not for me, and I'm a medical person, so let's see. Surrender Coley appeared completely calm and showed no sign of remorse or any other strong emotion during interrogation. He was the servant of a wealthy businessman in an industrial district outside of New Delhi in India, and he'd been telling the police investigators about his actions for the past year and a half. When he was home alone, he repeatedly lured girls from as young as 4 to his master's house. He then strangled and performed on the bodies. That her breast to serve himself a cannibalistic meal. Other times he recalled how he temporarily interrupted his ritual because guests were arriving at the house. He would then resume his duties as a servant before returning to his bathroom to continue. Under the cover of darkness, he would throw the plastic bags containing the remains into a sewer drain in the garden, where they were finally found in December of 2006. The police counted 19 skulls and 608 other body parts. They may have originated from over 30 children who disappeared without a trace from the area. After a trial spanning many years, he was finally sentenced to death for a total of 10 murders. What? 19 skulls, but 10? Oh, okay. During the investigation, he was examined by psychologists. They performed an IQ test and found that he was unusually gifted with a good memory. When interviewing him, they noticed how he would sit for hours without changing his facial expression. He was then shown pictures and ink blots and asked to describe them. He responded reluctantly, only able to offer descriptions with no content or emotional response. His responses were both veiled and guarded. When he was asked to deal with emotional situations, he tended to use denial, avoidance, and escape into fantasy. You think? The constant disassembling can be viewed as if the subject is always wearing a mask to hide their true self. When he was asked to draw a man and a woman, he made a childish drawing of a young man and a girl aged between 8 and 10. occipital lobe. Scientists believe that psychopaths partially lose their ability to understand visual impressions that involve emotions such as fear, depression, or surprise. This means that when a psychopathic serial killer commits a murderous act, they probably know full well they're violating all socially acceptable rules, performing a morally reprehensible act, but remain unaffected and feel no remorse afterwards. Yeah. Another feature common to so many serial killers is that around 2/3 of them have been subjected to physical, mental, or SA during their childhood. A lot of research suggests that childhood abuse may be the trigger that creates a serial killer. Abuse and other traumatic experiences leave traces in the brain and affect the flow of nerve impulses for the rest of a person's life. This occurs because because of the way the brain's many millions of nerve cells communicate using electrical signals. Okay, well, hopefully you'll understand this, alright. The electrical signals which run through the elongated nerve cells, almost like an electric current travels through a wire. But the nerve cells aren't directly connected to each other. Instead, they are separated by synapses, which are infinitesimal gaps, mere fractions of a millimeter wide. To traverse the gap, the electrical signal must first be converted into a chemical one, compromising the biochemical molecules known as neurotransmitters. Those then flow over the synapses from one nerve ending to the other, where they're intercepted and converted back into an electrical nerve signal, which is then transmitted on to the other nerve. Neurotransmitters come in many different types, including dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Some are designed to help push the nerve impulses further across the synapses, while others work in reverse to make it harder for the impulse to pass. In this way, neurotransmitters act like traffic lights to regulate the winding pathways of nerve impulses through the brain, and they play a critical role in people's thoughts and actions. Well, that's just... I understand people being totally too wasted. Alright, I'm just looking at... I don't wanna bore you, okay? I don't wanna bore you. I'm boring myself just a hair, so... Alright, studies have shown that childhood abuse increases the brain's production of dopamine and norepinephrine, while lessening the effects of serotonin. These chemical neurotransmitters play a crucial role in our mood and behavior, and someone's personality changes markedly if their balance shifts. On its own, dopamine makes people take more risks, while norepinephrine increases alertness and reaction times. Increased levels of both dopamine and norepinephrine lead to more impulsive, risky behavior with less thought for consequences. Serotonin usually helps us calm down, but low levels of it can, when combined with high levels of norepinephrine, make us more aggressive. When combined with increased amounts of dopamine, lead to a larger sex drive. These and other effects don't just limit themselves to presenting immediately after the assault. That is because the neurotransmitters cause the nerve impulses to take different routes, which imprint themselves in the brain to establish completely new nerve patterns and corresponding patterns of behavior. One serial killer who was heavily influenced by childhood abuse was American Henry Lee Lucas. He's over here. As a child, he was forced to go to school wearing a dress and watch his mother have sex with men other than his father. She was also violent to both him and his father, who had lost both legs in an accident. As 10-year-old, he injured an eye in a fight, and after his mother ignored it, complications arose, so it had to be removed. He dropped out of school in the 6th grade, ran away from home, and, according to his own confessions, started killing. He ran rampant through the United States from 1960 to 1983. Most of his victims were people he knew well. His preferred method was stabbing and suffocation. He was convicted of murdering his own mother, age 24, and after his release 10 years later, carried on killing. What? His victims included his 82-year-old employer, his girlfriend of 15 years, an unidentified woman dubbed as Orange Socks, but he confessed to dozens more. All right. Researchers believe that the abuse that he'd suffered played a key role in turning him into a serial killer, but a person's innate genes also play a part in increasing the risk of turning them into a serial killer. I am not going to read the rest of the stuff about the MAOA gene and all that stuff. Let's see. In the average killer, this part of the brain is often small. Okay. In many cases, scientists have discovered a huge difference when examining the brains of regular murderers compared to that of serial killers. Although there are individual variations, the two types of killers have some characteristic brain abnormalities that either predispose them to stop after the first murder or carry on killing again and again. One difference lies in the frontal lobes, which are responsible for advanced human abilities such as judgment, self-control, and problem-solving. This is where a dampener is put on impulsive reactions such as eating a colleague's packed lunch because you're hungry. And this area is also responsible for investigating alternative solutions to your problems rather than acting on your first instincts. Oh, okay. The average killer, however, this part of the brain is often smaller than normal. It makes them react impulsively, take numerous risks, and struggle to control themselves. As a result, ordinary murders aren't usually premeditated or well planned. In contrast, a serial killer's frontal lobe often functions completely normally, or maybe even larger than normal. They therefore plan their murders carefully and execute them in a well thought out his grandmother Maud, a brisk, domineering woman who was always taunting her grandson. I couldn't please her, he said. I became a walking time bomb, and I finally blew. One hot August day in 1964, he was sitting alone at the kitchen table with Maud, who asked him not to stare so strangely. Ed pulled his chair back, grabbed his rifle, and said he was going out to shoot bunnies. All right, but mind you, don't shoot the birds, Maud retorted. Ed felt an explosive rage, and he aimed the rifle at his grandmother. A bang resounded in the kitchen, and blood splattered. 2 more shots in the back ensured that his grandmother was unalived. He pulled her into his grandparents' bedroom and briefly considered undressing her, but changed his mind. Just then he heard his grandfather's car pull up outside. The 72-year-old had been shopping, and he was standing by the car removing his groceries when Ed fired into his grandfather's head. For a moment he panicked and tried to hide the evidence, but realized the deaths couldn't be explained away as accidents. Okay, I'll keep my comments to myself. Instead, he called the local sheriff, who came over to the farm. He confessed to having committed the murders, and when the astonished officer asked him why, he calmly replied, "I just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma." He briefly ended up in a juvenile detention center, but when a psychiatrist spoke to him, he concluded that Ed was a paranoid schizophrenic. So he was sent for treatment at California's Escudero, I think that's how you say that, State Hospital. At that hospital, Dr. William Schanberger was in daily contact with Ed, and the psychiatrist quickly sensed that he was a bright fellow, so intelligent he scored a 136 on an IQ test. Schanberger therefore gave the young inmate a job in the hospital's research lab, where psychiatrists soon came to regard him as a very good worker. As the years went by, he appeared more and more normal, because the intelligent killer understood what doctors wanted him to say, and he obliged them. He made an excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be a danger to himself or any members of society, a psychiatrist wrote in a report shortly before Kemper's juvenile records were expunged. Now wait a minute, dude. a colossus of a human being, far too tall to become a police officer. Is that a thing? Whatever. Instead, he was periodically employed by the State Highway Department. His size earned him the nickname Big Ed down at the jury room, where no one inquired about his past. Kemper also relieved his frustrations in other ways. He would drive hundreds of miles in his car around the area between San Francisco and Santa Cruz, often passing young female hitchhikers. After a while, he started picking them up. He enjoyed their company if you must go out, walk in pairs. Do not hitch a ride was posted on the notice boards in the university towns. But the warnings didn't stop Kimber from hanging out in the jury room, where the off-duty police officers imagined that Big Ed would never hurt a fly. He had a great personality. He was very friendly and outgoing, recalled Officer Jim Connor, who often spoke with Big Ed at the bar. So I'm going to stop and tell you about the pictures down below. I know you can't see it very clearly, but 64, his grandmother Maud Kimber. 64, grandfather Ed Kimber. 72, Marianne. 72, Anita. 72, Aiko. 73, Cindy. 73, Rosalind. 73, Alice. 73, Clarnell. 73, Sally. Apparently he liked to keep trophies of his victims, like university IDs and things like that. In the jury room, the serial killer kept his ears open to hear the latest news about his victims that had been found in the area. He hung out with the officers as though he were one of the boys while they talked over the investigation. To his great satisfaction, he could tell that the police officers were getting nowhere. As the months went by, the police found more and more corpses who'd been killed by the co-ed killer. Even though he tried to hide them, he felt that the net was tightening around him, and he was convinced that his friends in the jury room had their eyes on him. He decided it was time for the final showdown. Time to kill his mother while he had the chance. Ever since he'd been trapped in the basement as a boy, he lines from the jury room worked. The officer on duty thought Kemper was winding him up and put the phone down. Only when Officer Jim Connor picked up the phone and Kemper shouted about the co-ed killing did they realize he was serious. While the patrol car was on its way, he told Connor about the 10 killings. Slowly, he calmed down. What I'm saying is, there's a break somewhere. I can't tell you what's wrong with me, Big Ed said desperately. Soon after, a patrol car pulled up beside him. The man's here. Whew, he's got a gun on me, Ed told the officer on the phone. The famous co-ed killer had finally been captured. After his arrest, he cooperated unconditionally with the police. He waived all of his legal rights and confessed to each murder in front of a tape recorder. He supplied all of the details and was almost proud to finally have the opportunity to demonstrate his excellent powers of recall. He was ready to take his punishment and declared that I certainly wouldn't trust me in society again. Even he thought that the only sensible thing would be to lock him up in a little room where I can't hurt anybody. His wish was fulfilled. On the 14th of November 1973, he received 8 life sentences, for which he continues to serve at the age of 1974 at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. I had no idea that he was still alive. Anyway, so that case is so, gruesome to me. I think he put her larynx in the garbage disposal. Ugh. So the next one is a case that I have covered, and y'all know all about this case, but I'm gonna read it to you anyway. I have a Ted Bundy playlist, which has every video I've ever done on him. I did a 5-part series, and then I read an article from his ex-girlfriend, and then I think I did something else. I can't remember. Anyway, I have a playlist down below. I'll link it for you. If you've not, those are old videos, so don't laugh at the blurriness of my camera, okay? Because let me tell you what, we was struggling back in the day, okay? This case, I know way more about it than I should. Okay. Across from Anne Rule, in the midst of a crisis clinic's office, sits a young man she's not seen before. This is Ted Bundy, says a colleague, pointing. He'll be working with you. Bundy looks up and smiles. He's shaved and groomed, not long-haired like most other young people. Stacks of textbooks are strewn across his desk. He gets Anne a cup of coffee, and she likes him immediately. Everything seems to be going for the 24-year-old man. He's studying psychology, and he receives top marks. He's already worked hard, climbing the Republican Party election staff ladder in Washington. The party foresees a great career ahead of him, perhaps as a top politician. He had a fiancée who worshipped him, unsurprisingly, thanks Anne. He's handsome, intelligent, and polite, with an aristocratic nose and captivating blue eyes. Ted Bundy smiles to his new colleague, pointing over on each phone. The whole night will be about unhappy people trying to unalive themselves. Do you think we can cope with all this? He asks. I sure hope so, replied Anne. January 4th, 1974, a house near the University of Washington. Ted Bundy had often fantasized Washington, Ted is on the hunt again, but more cold-bloodedly this time. Pretty Linda Healy with chestnut hair is drinking beer with her roommates in the university bar called Dante's. When she gets home, she talks on the phone with her ex-boyfriend and watches TV until going to bed at 11 o'clock. Ted is watching the house. He's been there before, and he knows that other young women are also living there. He glides up to the dark house through an unlocked door. He opens the door to a random room in the basement where Linda is sleeping. He feels a moment of panic but quickly suppresses it. He overpowers the sleeping girl, beats her unconscious, and gags her without waking up her friend in the next bed. Premeditatingly, he removes her nightgown. Oh, I got a cough. Hold on, guys. Definitely ready to be done doing that. Okay. He removes her nightgown and hangs it in the wardrobe. He wraps her up in a sheet from the bed, on which he then carefully puts on a new sheet. I don't understand. He then packs some of her clothes into a rucksack that he brought with him. He drags her out of the house. It seems like Lydia has just left her room, exactly as Ted had planned. He carries his victim out to his Volkswagen and drives away. Linda Healy is never seen again. July 14th, 1974. Lake Sammamish, Washington. Every month since the attack on Joni Lynn's in January, Ted has killed a young woman, but the police are stumped. The sun beats down on a lake in the middle of a popular national park. People throw frisbees, bathe, and barbecue. 22-year-old Janice Graham is standing at the park's bandstand, waiting, when a young man turns around. He is dressed in white and has an arm in a sling. He asks her if she will help him get his sailboat onto the trailer. She thinks he looks trustworthy and goes with him. But when they reach his Volkswagen, she can see neither a trailer or a boat. "Where is it?" she asks. "At my parents' house on the hill," replies the stranger. "Oh, I can't go with you. I'm meeting my husband and walks between shops, a man turns to her, saying he's Officer Rosalind from the local police. And Carol thinks he's a strange policeman. He stinks of alcohol, has greasy hair, and is wearing patent leather shoes. But still she follows him and he asks her to come to the parking lot and check her car regarding a possible burglary. When they see her car is intact, he asks her to come to the station. Reluctantly, she follows him to a wretched, battered Volkswagen. When they leave the mall, Bundy steers the car over to the side of the road and reaches for Carol. She screams as they fight in the seats. She panics and scratches out so that her nails break. "I'm gonna blow your brains out," shouts Bundy, threatening her with a gun. Carol pushes her door open and is half out of the car when he raises a crowbar over her head. He swings at her, but she manages to stave off the stroke. Fear gives her strength, and with a desperate jerk, she pulls free of his grip and tumbles into the street. She stumbles away, trembling with fear. Behind her, the Volkswagen speeds up, pulls a U-turn, and tears away with screeching tires. Carol staggers out in front of a car. The couple driving stop immediately. Carol is shaking, tears running down her cheeks. Later that same evening, Bountiful, Utah. Ted has driven north to a nearby town where he now seeks new victims at Viewmont High School. The school play is about to begin. 1,500 audience members await. Drama teacher Raylene Shepherd is now on her way through the hall when she suddenly comes face to face with Ted. "Hello," he says. this case. Never mind. I'm not ruining anything. Whatever. He jumps over a fence, lands with a tumble on the other side. He zigs and zags between people, but no one takes any notice. He starts to run up Aspen Mountain along a dirt road. He's close to collapsing with fatigue when he stops far up the mountain. On June 13th, he is about to collapse from exhaustion and hunger and returns to Aspen. He stands in front of a Cadillac. He's dizzy. After having traveled 80 kilometers on foot during the escape, he has lost 13 kilograms, but he's now cheering inside. The keys are in the car. He gets in and head for the city's outskirts, but his eyes flicker and he thinks he sees a detour ahead. He turns the car around and wobbles back towards the city. Two officers on patrol see the zigzagging Cadillac and call it in. One of the officers pulls Ted out of the car, and when he sees the driver, he immediately radios his partner. This looks like Ted Bundy. After being recaptured, Ted is accused of a number of new crimes, including escaping the courtroom. One quiet Friday night, Ted Bundy gently removes an iron plate from the prison cell ceiling. The slightest sound could reveal what he's doing. He's used all of his flair for planning and deception this time to prepare his escape and save himself from inevitable death. The last 6 to 8 weeks he's worked to cut a 30 by 30 centimeter rectangle out of the metal plate in the cell ceiling. He has sawn with a smuggled hacksaw when other prisoners were noisy and shouting in the showers. The loose plate is cut so perfectly it can be put into place so the guards cannot see he's tampered with the ceiling. To get into this space, he has slimmed down to 63 kilograms. He's been moving around up there on his stomach for the past 2 weeks. He's found a way out, a passage just over a guard's apartment. He pulls himself up through the opening, moves quietly through the dark void between the ceiling and the roof. It feels like an echo chamber. Even a lost fingernail would make a racket. He moves almost silently because he is above the guard's apartment. He hears voices. Morris and the guard and his wife are eating dinner. Half-hour later, it sounds as if they've left the room. Ted moves back to his cell, puts his legal documents in a pile under the covers, so at first glance it looks like he's just sleeping. He pulls himself up into the cavity again, puts the metal plate back in place, and crawls toward the guard's apartment. Then he sneaks out through the prison door and out into the cold night. He knows they will not discover his flight until the morning. He has changed his routine, so he no longer goes to breakfast together with the other prisoners. Neri kisses her date goodbye at the doorstep of the women's fraternity Chi Omega house at 3 o'clock. When she enters the hallway, she notices that the door is unlocked. The light in the foyer is on, so she goes to turn it off. Suddenly, she hears running footsteps coming from the hallway upstairs where the girls are asleep. The sounds comes down the stairs towards the foyer where she's standing. A man runs, his head bowed for the door. In his right hand, he's holding a nearly 1 meter long truncheon. His cap is pulled down over his forehead, but Nita manages to notice the straight, almost aristocratic nose on the man before he's out the door and gone. Nita goes upstairs and awakens some friends to see if they know anything about this guy. While discussing the situation, the door to room 8 opens and out totters Karen Chandler. She seems drunk at first. They call to her and she turns. Immediately they see the blood. Her face is smashed appears she too has forgotten something. So, Kimberly runs ahead. A white van is parked in the car park. A witness who drives past a minute later sees a teenage girl with long hair. She seems to be crying, and a man is pulling her angrily towards his car. The passerbys think that the girl had probably angered her father. Nothing unusual there. Oh, my camera froze again. Whatever. 57 days later, the girl's corpse is found in a big bin. Her throat had been cut, and she has been essayed. February 15th, 1978. Kimberly's body has yet to be found, but her kidnapping has caused the police to make every effort to catch Ted. Officer David Lee radios to get the license plate of an orange Beetle which is driving slowly in front of him checked. The answer comes a moment later. Stolen. Lee turns on the siren, and at that moment the car in front of him accelerates. He hurries after him, forcing cars aside. His gun drawn, he goes over and requests the driver to get out. As Lee locks the handcuffs around Ted's hand, he suddenly turns and kicks the officer's legs away, then throws himself at prostrate Lee, who fires. Bundy runs. Lee chases after him. Stop, 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 or I'll shoot. He shoots, and the fleeing Bundy collapses. Lee runs over and bends down. Suddenly, Ted jumps up without a scratch, gripping his pursuer's arm, and the two men grapple. Help, help, shouts Ted to Lee's surprise. Finally, the policeman succeeds in getting the prisoner's hands behind his back and locking the handcuffs. Lee has no idea he's just caught one of the FBI's most wanted criminals. I wish you'd killed me, Bundy suddenly says. If I escape from prison, will you kill me? July 1931, 1979, July 31st. Ted Bundy is convicted of the murders in the sorority Chi Omega. Ted Bundy is speaking for his life. The former law student gesticulates wildly as he explains himself. I'm not asking for mercy, he says, for I find it absurd to ask for mercy for something I have not done. What? Judge Edward Cowart focuses on the face of Bundy on trial that day. Not the sharp lawyer or polite charmer, but America's worst serial killer. A man who decapitated, mutilated, and disfigured girl after girl. It is ordered that you be put to death by the current of electricity, says the judge. He looks at Ted and his voice softens. It is an utter tragedy for this court to see a total waste of humanity. You are a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. The judge keeps it short. Take care of yourself, young man. On January 24th, 1989, after several appeals and postponements, the time has come. On the way to the execution chamber, Ted confesses to 2 murders, just as he's revealed others the day before. The list now includes 30. Is it all of them? He is asked. Can I bum a cigarette? He replies. He's given one, but doesn't mention any more names. At 7 o'clock, he's led into the gray chamber. 6 minutes later, a hooded executioner goes in, to Ted, who sits strapped in a chair. The executioner presses a large button, and 2,000 volts flow through his body. He twitches once, and he's silent. Elizabeth waits for 20 minutes. When Robert does not return, she goes outside to look for him, but he has disappeared. Feeling concerned, Elizabeth drives home and rings one of the pharmacy owners, a man named Phil Dorff. Dorff said that they were visited that day by the owner of a construction company that is going to do some work for them. The owner, a man named John Gacy, officers do not have to wait long outside the house. When they are caught totally off guard when Venice and Casey come rushing out of the driveway in their respective cars. They have a good head start by the time police start their pursuit. They lose sight of John just after 20 seconds and have to conclude they have been shaken off. Can you imagine? They are embarrassed and they go drives on, they seize the marijuana and resume pursuit. The officers report to the station at regular intervals. They now have grounds to arrest Casey, not for murder, but for distribution. At 11:45, John and one of his employees, a man named David Graham, go into a restaurant to meet with attorney Leroy Stevens. During the meeting, David goes outside for a moment and police seize him. Graham has had previous dealings with the police. He tells them that John is affected by pills and alcohol, that he has a knife, and he execution was delayed.